Howdy folks, Kevin here. Got another video for you today. This time it's going to be a presentation that I gave at a webinar, an online webinar. This presentation was supposed to be pretty short, around 5 minutes, but it ran a little bit longer. And I'm actually going to do a little bit longer today in this one because I have a little bit more time. The webinar was really cool. It was me with a bunch of other testers. People who test. I was going to say testing experts, but that would imply that I'm a testing expert, and I'm not too sure about that. They're testing experts, and I was joining them. I'm going to have a link to it. It'll probably appear like there or there somewhere. Have a watch through it. If you're interested, it goes, they all gave their own presentations, really cool stuff, and then we had a round table at the end. It was a really interesting discussion, and if you watch this video, then you can skip through that section of it, because this one's hopefully better, because I've practiced it more. I already did a full recording of this and had to get rid of it because the hard drive space ran out and it didn't do my recording. So there's 20 minutes gone of my day, which I just love. Anyway, let's get to it. So I've informally named this talk, Developers Just Test Your Code, because it's that simple, right? It's just the only reason developers don't test their code is because they're lazy bums, right? Am I right? No, I'm not right. The reason developers don't test their code is for a lot of things, and it's not a reflection of how skilled they are or their worth as a human being. And also, developers do test their code. I'll kind of explain that in just a minute. But if we go with the assumption that they're not, we have to ask ourselves, why are devs not testing? This is something that actually is brought up in conversation a lot and questioned a lot. Why would developers not test their code? And it sounds like a good question because, there's still bugs being released to sites, and code coverage isn't 100% on a lot of projects, and pull requests are opened, and they have bugs in them, and you have to go back and fix it, and all sorts of stuff. And it's all because developers aren't testing. Well, I decided to look at the data around that kind of informally. I'm not a data scientist, whatever. But I did want to look through some surveys and see, do developers really test their code? Here's one of them. This was from a front-end tooling survey in 2018, and it asks, which tool do you use to test your JavaScript? Now, that big red area there is people who don't use a tool to test their JavaScript, and that looks huge, but in reality, that's only half the people out there. So 50% people do test their code. That's more than 5 or 10 or 20% that you kind of assume would be the case if we're saying that developers don't test their code. The other thing about this question is that it's asking about unit test frameworks itself, not testing in general. There are so many different layers to testing, and unit testing is just one small slice of it. Of all the developers out there asked in this survey, only 44% don't do unit testing. They probably do other types of testing. There was another survey that was done, this time by the folks at NPM. I'm not sure where they got their data from, but I'm going to assume that it's valid. And they asked whether you use a test framework or not. And you see, even less than a year of experience, almost 60% of developers use a test framework. And as you get more experienced, you're more likely to use a test framework, up to about 90%. That's actually really good. 60 to 90% of developers are testing or using a test framework. That's more than developers not testing. There was another survey, looked at another survey. It said, do you write tests? And only 22% said no. They never write any tests. If you look at the sometimes and the yes, that's about 75% of developers write tests. It's pretty much in line with what we saw with the previous NPM question. That was 2 years ago. So more people probably write tests because it's become more popular, things like that. I asked this question on my Twitter feed and got only 27 votes, not a lot of people responding. It still shows that 7% of the respondents don't have tests. Most of them, the majority of them have tests, some but not enough, they feel. And again, it goes back to this feeling of we're just not doing enough testing out there and we need to be better about it. Back to the question though of do developers write tests? The answer for me that I think is that developers are testing, but they don't seem content or happy with the results of that testing. And so we need to look at why is this? The first question I want to ask is it the tools? Nothing would keep you from testing like having to work with crappy tools. That would really be such a drag to have to do. So again, I looked at the survey, and there was a question where it asked, have you used this test framework and would you use it again? If you look at the results of the 3 most popular frameworks out there, of those who have used it, the wide majority of them would use it again. And I think Jest is really nailing it out of the park as far as customer satisfaction goes, because look, there's barely a sliver of people who have used it and wouldn't use it again, compared to Mocha and Jasmine, where you have about 10% each of respondents who have used it and wouldn't use it again. Like 40% of respondents have used Mocha, 40% have used Jest. Almost 40% of respondents have used Jasmine as well, and they would use it again. Well, 30% would use it again. In that same survey, there was another question about how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 5, and you see it starts out at 3.2 2 years ago, and now it's at 3.8, so that happiness has gone up. You could probably credit that to Jest, because you saw how that number of people who have used it and would use it again, that probably correlates to this. So overall, we're pretty happy. A 3.8, pretty good out of 5. That's kind of the range that I'm looking for on Amazon when I go to buy a product. I want it to be at least like 3.8 or higher. So good and improving. Great. So it's not the tools. I really don't think it's tools. I think Jest solved a lot of problems. Mocha, I still like Mocha. I prefer Mocha, although I don't have a lot of opportunity to use Jest in my workday. I have used it, but I'm really happy with Mocha. It does the job really well, and it's got a lot of great features in there. Anyway, so I don't think it's the tooling. Could it be the documentation? Maybe people are having trouble like using the tooling or working through things. If you look at these that same survey that we were looking at, the most liked aspect of Jest is its documentation. And then under the 4th most liked aspect is that it's easy to learn. If we look at Mocha, it's about the same. Documentation is number 3, easy to learn is number 2. So it doesn't seem like it's the documentation because people really like it. Like that's the most beneficial feature, most prized feature of this is the documentation. I don't think it's that. Plus, a lot of courses out there, a lot of online courses and books and stuff, they're starting to pick up testing as like, I can't just teach how to use this framework or whatever. I have to teach how to test in this framework as well. Wes Boss, he has a recent course on advanced React where he covers an entire module, 12 videos on how to test in React, how to test the code that they've written. And then Kent C. Dodds, who was on that webinar panel with me, he has just released a full course called Testing JavaScript. It just goes to show how in demand this information is and how useful it is to developers to know how to test. What is it that is really causing this concern among developers about not testing? I asked that on Twitter a couple years back. A lot of the answers were, it's hard to start. I don't know where to get going. You look here, it's either I don't know how to start or not prioritize, not have enough time. Not much outside of that. I do think I could have phrased this answers a little bit better, but I got some really good responses in there about what's holding them back. A lot of it had to do with getting things set up, not sure what to test to begin with, like building a test plan, how do you run them, all sorts of things. Kind of not how to write a specific test, but how to integrate testing into your entire project workflow, which is kind of odd to see because the documentation was supposed to be good, right? That was like the highest thing is the documentation. I thought about this when I was putting together this presentation, and it really hit me in this question. I really didn't put these answers right because it's never prioritized and I don't have enough time. Those two are basically the same answers because you're not going to have enough time if it's not prioritized. That's over 50%. That kind of changes the ordering of how people answer this. And also, I don't know how to start. The reason you don't know how to start is you don't have the time to learn how to start. Again, that comes back to it's never prioritized. Why would testing not be prioritized? Because you've always been told that testing is the right thing to do, right? Okay, so I went to Stack Overflow, as you always should if you need an answer to anything. And I needed an answer to, is unit testing worth the effort? And here's this nice, good list of all the reasons you should unit test. And it's got a ton of upvotes, so people probably agree with it. And so, like, look at that. That's perfectly good reason for why it should be prioritized. What's the disconnect? Why are we not getting it prioritized? Well, I'm going to steal this quote from Kent's Testing JavaScript website with this imaginary person coming back and saying, well, there's no obvious return on investment to testing, and I can't get buy-in or budget for my testing efforts. And if we look at this list of reasons to test, you don't really see a good return on investment or selling point for somebody who isn't a developer. Like if you went to your project manager and you said, well, unit testing, it helps me understand the design of the code I'm working on. That's not a good selling point. Like maybe they really have to have a lot of empathy for you as a developer. They may just be like, what do you mean the design of the code? It's code. Like, you might run into that. So you're having trouble selling these features because these aren't things that people in control of the budget care about, sadly. But it's just the truth is they're focused on the budget, on the timeline, things like that. You're focused on the code. We can't focus on everything. Otherwise, it's just never going to get done. What I think we need to do, and these are getting into my opinions, is we either need to sell testing better or just stop asking for permission and just do it. Can we do this? Well, here's how we can do it. I looked again at Stack Overflow. I was really getting into these surveys. They were really insightful kind of stuff. And there was one question, what would developers choose for their performance metrics? It's not quite what managers measure employee performance on or develop performance on, but from a developer standpoint, which is just as valid as a manager standpoint. If you look here, where is testing on this list? I'll say bugs found. Bugs found is part of testing. That's the whole point of testing is you find bugs. Look how low it is on that list. It's barely above the number of hours worked and below self-rating, which is kind of funny. But what's at the top of the list? Customer satisfaction. If we really want to sell this as something that is very valuable, we need to stop focusing on finding bugs per se and really focus about customer satisfaction. So let's think about what is important for your tests. What do we focus on? Code coverage, number of tests. The thing is, users don't care about that. They're not going to your site because it's got 100% code coverage. They're not going to your site because you have 1,000 tests that run in 2 minutes on your CI/CD system and all this kind of stuff. What they care about is being able to use your site. That's what's important. So why do we focus on code coverage? Well, because it's easy to measure. We've got these cool little tools that do it for us, and it's something that we can immediately impact. You don't write a test and say, yeah, that's going to make the customer happy, because it's not going to make the customer happy having written a test. The other thing about customer satisfaction in this regard is that you write a test, it doesn't go immediately to production. You have to go through testing and all this and releases and all this kind of stuff compared to code coverage where, yeah, you can immediately impact that code coverage number so it feels good. So we just have this natural tendency to focus on code coverage and those type of metrics and number of tests and all that kind of thing. Kind of end up focusing on that because it's easier for us to focus on, and we forget about customer satisfaction because it's a harder thing to focus on. Unfortunately, that's kind of the downfall that we're running into, is we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot by doing this because we're focusing on what's not important and spending all of our energy on improving that and forgetting about what's the most important thing just because it doesn't quite fit into our daily flow. So let's think about what makes users happy. Obviously, it's not having bugs. Obviously, you want a website that works. But what's better than a website that works? A website that gets better at working. What really helps is responding to feedback, improving, adding functionality, that type of thing. So it's not just about not having bugs. It's about getting better and better and more streamlined and everything. The trouble is, we hurt ourselves when we write tests because a lot of our testing practices can make it harder to refactor code, harder to rework things. We end up so focused, again, on that code coverage number that we add tests in that don't help. We're just doing it for the sake of writing a test. We end up having tight coupling in our tests, and we poorly manage our dependencies and just all sorts of things like that that make it more difficult for us to make updates. I mean, how many times have you wanted to add a new feature and you go through the work of coding it, then you run the same set of tests that you ran before, and it breaks half of them. Or you want to refactor the code, and it completely messes up the test, just completely wipes it out. And now you're stuck. Not only do I have to refactor the code, now I have to rework how all my tests are written, and I don't have time for this. I needed this to go out yesterday. I'm just going to delete the test folder. that kind of thing. So I think before we write any sort of test, we need to ask ourselves, is this going to make it easier for me to update my code in the future? Or is it just something that gets in the way? Things like, this is one of the biggest drawbacks of snapshot testing. Sure, it's testing stuff, but it's almost too big of a hammer, and it's going to make it harder to update the code. If we're going to reprioritize testing, we need to start selling the result, which is happier customers. And we need to allow our decisions on whether we write a test or not to be driven by this idea of happier customers. Now, when we come to selling this, I wanted to come up with a few phrases that you could say, or a few things you could go to your project manager or manager with. One of those is, testing helps me know that I'm not ruining things for our customers. I feel like that's a really good selling point for somebody who's focused on making sure that their customer is happy, compared to somebody who isn't focused on code quality or anything. Like, testing helps improve my code quality. Yay. That doesn't immediately align with getting it right for the customer. And so it's just much more effective to sell it as what's important to the person you're selling it to, not what's important to yourself. Obviously, code quality is important to somebody who works in the code all the time, but the reason why it's important is so that you can make things right for the customer, so that you can not release bugs, so that you can quickly iterate, things like that. That's why it's really important, not just for the sake of code quality. Along those lines, you could say, I can't be effective at my job if I'm not spending time working on tests. This is a great thing to tell your manager, because what is your manager responsible for? Making sure you're effective at your job. That's the whole reason they're getting paid, is so that you can do your work correctly. Now, I will say some managers forget this fact, that their job is to make sure that you can do your job, and they get in the way of that. But if you have a good manager, hopefully you do, they'll really be interested in the fact that writing tests helps you be more effective. When you change it from, I need to write tests because our code coverage is below 80%, to I need to write tests because it lets me do my job faster, better, helps me meet deadlines faster, things like that, you're really changing how you're selling it. Again, you're selling what's important to the person you're selling to, instead of what's important to you. Overall, I think the main idea here is that we move testing from this guilt-ridden, I should do testing because that's what the best practices say to do, to more about testing is something I do to get things done. Or testing is something I don't do because I need to get things done. And that's okay. There are definitely many reasons that you shouldn't write a test. And there are many reasons that you should write a test. And you need to weigh these two. You don't write a test for the sake of writing a test. You write a test because it helps you improve customer satisfaction by being able to more easily adjust what you're doing, what you're working on, what the features are, and how things work like that. So that's the end of this presentation. Here's the references. I'll have all these links in the description below, and I will also have the link to the slides in the description below. I'd love to hear your feedback on what you thought about this. If you have any other thoughts on this whole idea of helping developers sell testing and how we can do that better, leave comments down below. That'd be awesome. And until next time, have fun testing.